August 15th, 1971. Palo Alto City Police arrive and arrest a suspect of an armed robbery and burglary. He is handcuffed, told his rights, and taken away. At the police station, the police take his fingerprints and mugshot and transport him to the Stanford County Jail. Except this man is innocent. He hasn't committed any crime and certainly not armed burglary. Is this a mistake? Did the police misunderstand the evidence and arrest the wrong suspect? No. This entire thing was a fake, a show. This wasn't a real arrest. And the Stanford County Jail? That's not even a real place. The so-called Stanford County Jail was built in the basement of the Stanford University to conduct the most infamous psychology experiment of them all, the Stanford Prison Experiment.
Hello, James.
Hello.
What is the Stanford Prison Experiment about?
So the Stanford Prison Experiment is a really controversial experiment that took place in 1971 at Stanford University, and it was run by Professor Philip Zimbardo. The basic premise of the experiment was that Zimbardo had recruited two groups of participants. The first group were going to be the prisoners, so the experiment would try and simulate the conditions where participants who were the prisoners would be in a setting that was like a prison in the United States. And he also recruited participants who would act as guards, and the guards would try and enforce the rules of the prison. The point of the experiment was to try and provide a naturalistic context to human behavior in certain settings. How, when given roles of authority, the guards would act towards the prisoners. And the point of this is there's trying to cut to some sort of the core questions of human nature and how we act towards others. So for the actual study itself, there was an advertisement that was placed. In that advertisement, participants would get $15 per day. Zimbardo, in his role as the experimenter, he documented each stage of the experiments through detailed journals. There was also aspects where he actually spoke to the guards themselves, providing them with instructions as to what they could and couldn't do in the experiment. And one of the things that he did was that he didn't allow them to be called by their names, the participants.
Now, I'm gonna use this whiteboard to draw things and explain things. But as you can tell, one of my manager's kids drew this thing, and I am not erasing this. This is art, so I'm not gonna touch this. Don't even think about it. I'll draw stuff here. This stuff, pretend it doesn't exist. It doesn't exist, okay, guys? And yeah, they didn't give me an eraser. This is gonna take a while. Right, so as it turns out, there is an eraser. I just was dumb enough not to spot it. It's not erasing anything. Forget about it, I'll just... Well, this is what we're working with. Okay, this one works. And I presume, considering this whole thing is green. Okay. Green and red. After arriving at the makeshift prison, the prisoners were systematically stripped and searched, then given uniforms with identification numbers, the same Zimbardo had instructed the guards to call the prisoners by. These uniforms were, to crudely put it, uncomfortable as shit. They were misfit, there was no underwear, and they had a chain around their foot. Give me a sec. Marvel at my great artistic skills. There were 15 prisoners put into 5 cells of 2 by 3 meters. That's about like 6 by 9 feet for the Americans. The cells had no source of light, and the only furnishing were the mattresses, sheets, and pillows. The guards, on the other hand, could go wherever they pleased, whenever they pleased, and they wore nice uniforms with mirrored glasses. I gotta admit, I'm into this. Further, these guards would rotate 8-hour shifts Of the 9 guards, only 3 were ever present. So while the prisoners had to remain in the prison all the goddamn time, the guards only had to be there for 8 hours, then they were off for 12. 16. This is why I'm not leading a math channel. After the first day at the prison went smoothly, the researchers expected everything else to go great. Except then, at 2:30 in the morning, the prisoners rebelled. They were woken up by the guards for counts. These counts were to familiarize the prisoners with their numbers. They took place at various times during the day, but more often at night. On this particular occasion, the prisoners rebelled. They ripped off their numbers and put their mattresses against the cell doors, barricading themselves inside. The night shift guards had no idea what to do, so they did nothing. Until the morning shift arrived. Then they decided to call in the other 3 guards that were on the next shift. So now all 9 guards were present. They took a fire extinguisher and just kind of into the cell, broke inside, stripped the prisoners, took the beds out, took every furnishing out, and they threw the leaders of this rebellion into solitary confinement. Afterwards, they began to harass, mistreat, and generally just make the prisoners' life hell. But how do you prevent further rebellion? And that's what they figured out. They created a so-called privileged cell. Hold up, I'm confused. It says 3. It says in my text there's 3 cells. Were there 5 cells or 3 cells? Because like earlier I said 5 cells. Put into 5 cells, 5 cells. 5 cells. Just as a reminder, someone read through this script and greenlit it. This is how low the budget is. I'll put the number of doors on screen. Either way, one of these cells was turned into the privileged cell, and 3 of the prisoners who were least involved in the rebellion were put inside. This cell had mattresses, blankets. I probably should stop raising my fingers or I'll drop the microphone. The prisoners were allowed to brush their teeth and were given better food. Further, one of the privileges given to them was bathroom privileges. You couldn't draw better. Why was this important? Because for the other cells, the guards could deny their request to go to the bathroom, and the prisoners were often forced to defecate into a bucket. A bucket that was often left inside the cell for way longer after use. Less than 36 hours after the experiment began, one of the prisoners, Douglas Douglas had a mental breakdown and was subsequently released. He was the first of the 5 prisoners who were released early. Keep this in mind, this will be important in a bit. Later that same day, some of the parents of the prisoners came over. Ahead of this, the prisoners were washed, groomed, and their cells made to look a lot more habitable. Then, upon arrival, the parents were made to register and were then forced to wait half an hour before given the chance to speak to their sons. Further, any complaints the parents had about the conditions were to be done in an arbitrary rules of the prison. But now the big event. There was a rumor, just a normal rumor, that Douglas, the one that had been released, was only simulating. His real plan was to get some friends and break into the prison and release the other prisoners. This rumor was overheard by one of the guards passing the cells. In the words of Zimbardo, this text is microscopic. Do you think we recorded a pattern of rumor transmission during the day and waited for the impending escape and then observed what happened? That was what we should have done. Of course, if we were all acting like experimental social psychologists, which is our usual role. Instead, by Tuesday, our main concern was to maintain the security of our prison. Afterwards, Zimbardo phoned the police and asked the prisoners to be transferred to their jail. They said no. So they made another plan. After the parents left the jail, the researchers and guards dismantled it. They changed the prisoners, put bags over their heads, put them inside a lift, and left them in the storage room on the 5th floor of the university with the guards. Zimbardo would then sit alone where the disassembled prison was and wait until the people, Douglas Corpi and his group, came over to free the prisoners and tell them that the experiment was quote-unquote over. No one came. No one. This was just a rumor. But it had significant effects. The researchers and guards had spent half a day disassembling the prison, moving the prisoners, all to find out It was for none. After this, the guards' treatment of the prisoners only worsened. One of the things they made them do is clean toilet bowls with their hands. His posture is a little bit mangled. On Wednesday, a strange event occurred which added a Kafkaesque element to our prison. A Catholic priest who had been a prison chaplain in Washington, D.C., was invited down to give an evaluation of how valid our prison situation was, and also because the grievance committee had requested church service. Why did I just whisper like that? I don't know. The grievance committee was a mock committee made by the prisoners to address any of their complaints or issues or whatever. And obviously, no one actually took it seriously. Either way, the priest came and began talking to the prisoners. The prisoner would sit down, begin talking with him, and then the priest would ask him a question. Son, what are you doing to get out of here? He told them that there was no one who'd help them, that they were completely alone. This quote added to the general level of confusion we were all beginning to feel about our roles, and where role ends and identity begins. The prisoners who were most disturbed by the priest's visit were those who had been able to convince themselves that this was not a real prison up to this time. But there was one prisoner who didn't speak to the priest. Prisoner 819. Whose full name is fully omitted from every public record of the study. He had refused to eat and said that he wanted to see a doctor, not a priest, and subsequently broke down crying, quote, hysterically. Zimbardo took the chain off his foot, cap off his head, and told him to rest. He was going to get him food when the guards lined up the other prisoners and had them chant.
Prisoner 819 did a bad thing. Prisoner 819 did a bad thing. Prisoner 819 did a bad thing.
I raced into the room once I realized that he could hear this. What I found was a boy crying hysterically, bawling, while in the background, his fellows, his other students just like him, were yelling that he was a bad prisoner, that they were being punished because of him.
After this, he took him and released him from the experiment. New prisoner was admitted. Prisoner 618. Look, okay, I want you to tell me how do I misread that as 618? It clearly says 416. 416. Upon arrival, he went on a hunger protest and wouldn't eat until the guards improved their treatment of the prisoners. The guards tried to force feed him, have the other prisoners force feed him, punished his cellmates for his defiance. They'd have him sing Amazing Grace while the other prisoners would do push-ups. Then, they threatened to cut the visiting hours for tomorrow. The prisoners shouted and yelled at 416, telling him to end this protest. When he didn't, the guards took him and threw him into solitary confinement. While their own rules dictated that someone could be thrown into solitary confinement for up to an hour, 416 spent 3 there. After this, one of the guards gave the prisoners a choice. They could give up their blankets and let 416 out, or keep them, and leave him there for the rest of the night. They chose the blankets. The prisoners then began to bang on the door of the solitary confinement and say, "Thank you, prisoner 416. On day 5, there was a mock parole held for the prisoners. With bags over their heads, they were taken to wait for the meeting. One by one, they were let in and discussed parole. At this point, they were offered an option. They could forfeit all the money and leave the study immediately. On the other hand, they could continue. Most had agreed to this offer, forfeiting all their money and asking to leave immediately. They were subsequently told to go back to their cells while the request was considered. About this situation, Zimbardo wrote, "Now realize that what we had made salient to them was the contract. That is, that they had agreed voluntarily to be prisoners, only because they needed the money they would receive for being experimental subjects. If they now no longer wanted the money, then naturally there was no reason or motivation to continue being a subject in this experiment. No one can be imprisoned against his will in an experiment, can he? What they should have said at this point is, I quit this experiment and no longer choose to be a subject for money, science, or any other reason. But they did not. They could not, because their sense of reality had undergone a transformation. They did not have the power to choose to leave the experiment because it was no longer an experiment to them. They were in a prison, where the verbal reality was parole, and forfeiting of wages earned for prison work. Events kept piling up. The parents had now called lawyers for their boys, playing along with the prison rules. More prisoners had suffered psychological harm and were released. The guards continued their brutality. Eventually, Christina Maslock came to visit the prison. She was distraught by what she saw and challenged Zimbardo. Her critique is said to be what made Zimbardo end the experiment. Thus, on day 6, the researchers held a brief meeting with the participants, discussing the events, their feelings, and forming their conclusions. The researchers' conclusion? That the Stanford prison study displayed the people's natural tendency to violence and oppression under the influence of power. Zimbardo's main claims included that social rules can influence behaviors. He claimed the guards' violence was direct evidence that good people can do evil things. Except that conclusion isn't universally accepted. While Zimbardo continued to uphold the validity of his experiment up to his death, the experiment remains highly controversial. The common point is ethics.
The ethics question here is should this experiment have ever taken place, given the conditions Zimbardo set up?
I mean, do I need to remind you that people were shitting in a bucket? And another important aspect is that the participants weren't involved about the extent of the experiment, and many suffered long-lasting psychological harm. For 2, debriefing wasn't held until much later, and many criticize it as not being thorough enough. Since this experiment, ethics in the psychology field have been a significant concern, and now many journals require ethical approval before a study can be published.
It's definitely influenced ethics practices and procedures. I mean, nowadays, if you're working in a psychology department, or actually many types of scientific departments, you have to go through what's called an ethics procedure. Submit an application for a study, and this study will be vetted by your peers, and those peers will apply principles that have been developed at a sort of national and international level. So in the UK, for instance, we have to adhere to ethics principles given by the British Psychological Society. In America, it will correspond to the American Psychological Association. All of these will have ethical guidelines, and they're quite rigorous and constraining in terms of what you can and cannot do in a psychology experiment. This holds for even what you would consider relatively low risk experiments. Besides the ethical issue, which is obviously an extremely important one, there's also been questions surrounding the scientific merit of the research. So to give 2 examples, the first is that when Zimbardo was recruiting, he had specific aspects of the advertisement which sort of highlighted that it was going to simulate a prison experiment, and this in itself could be subject to something like a selection bias, where essentially the people who were likely to participate in the experiment would be more prone to certain types of behavior, like those that we saw in the actual experiment. So for instance, when you see an advertisement like that, you might end up recruiting people, this is where the selection effect comes in, who are more prone to sort of abusive type behavior.
Many psychologists debate whether the participants behaved as they chose to, or whether they were behaving the way they believed prisoners and guards should behave. What I am referring to right now is called demand characteristics. Characteristics applied specifically because that's what is demanded of them. To add, many critique Zimbardo's conduction of the study, claiming he was to blame for their behavior. Zimbardo specifically told the guards, "We cannot physically abuse or torture them. We can create boredom, we can create a sense of frustration, we can create fear in them to some degree, we can create a notion of arbitrariness," what the f*** is this word? Arbitrariness that governs their lives, which are totally controlled by us, by the system, by you, me, je fais. Is that how you pronounce that name? They'll have no privacy at all. There will be constant surveillance. Nothing they do will go unobserved. They will have no freedom of action. They will be able to do nothing and say nothing that we don't permit. We're going to take away their individuality in various ways. They're going to be wearing uniforms, and at no time will anyone call them by their name. They will have numbers and be called only by their numbers. In general, what all this should create in them is a sense of powerlessness. We have total control in the situation. They have none.
that in itself ends up questioning the scientific merit of this research, because the point of science partly is that you have some sort of phenomena and you want to investigate that. And to investigate that, you come up with hypotheses about how individuals will behave in a certain context. But in this case, if you're providing instructions as to how they should behave, you're essentially building your results.
Here's what Peter Gray had to say about this whole study. What would have happened if Zimbardo had said to the guards at the outset that the purpose of the experiment was to prove that it is possible to be both a guard and a decent human being, or in some way implied that the goal was to prove that guards can be kind? I bet the results would have been entirely different. The situation would have been the same, but the demand would have been different, and the result would have been different. John Mark, one of the guards in the study, alleged that Zimbardo was purposefully creating tension. He even made an AMA on Reddit. However, nearly all articles and links featuring John Mark's letters have been removed or lead nowhere. So there's a reason to be skeptical of this information. But to add to this, only a third of the guards, that is, 3 people, displayed sadistic tendencies. Then one could argue that this experiment showed, no, people don't conform to the situation. That one being Eric Fromm, who put out this exact statement. But the biggest and likely the most valid criticism lies in the study's reproducibility, or rather, the lack of such. Reproducing this study one-to-one is practically impossible. For one, because of the ethics. There were attempts, and in fact, in 2002, another prison study was conducted that had completely different results. There will be a video coming out about that study. Subscribe to see it. All that being said, the Stanford prison experiment has had positive impacts. It caused more research into the prison system and the person situation attribute. It led to significant reforms in prisons, precisely because its display of inhumane practices.
The other legacy, and perhaps the more subtler one, has been on this question of scientific merit and how we conduct an experiment. And I think in this sense, the Stanford prison experiment fed through to these wider debates about how do we do good science in terms of how do we recruit participants? How do we make sure the experimenter is not unduly influencing the experiment? I think all of these factors resulted in a more rigorous ethical set of scientific practices and approaches. I think in sum, even though the Stanford prison experiment is arguably one of the darkest chapters in the history of psychology, it's also brought to light many issues and problems that are hopefully guiding us towards a more promising future in psychology.
And of course, the question the viewers are dying to find out: what is your favorite color?
Black.